welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Hello and welcome to the Skeptic Zone, episode number 82 for the 14th of May 2010. It's Richard Saunders here from my little studio in Sydney, Australia. An interesting show this week. A grain of salt with Eran Segev, and Eran is talking to John McDonough, a firefighter. Yes, a firefighter. Skepticism and firefighting. Critical thinking and firefighting. Here's an interesting take on critical thinking. I think you'll enjoy it. After that, we have Dr. Rachie Reports with an update with our wacky and crazy and zany, freaked-out friends at the Australian Vaccination Network. What wacky adventure have they been up to this week? We'll find out soon with Dr. Rachie. Now, I'm pleased to say, just a couple of days ago, I finally finished filming and editing the first Skeptic Zone sort of official video in the new How It's Done series, where we look at applied kinesiology. Now, if you want to look at that video online and recommend it to your friends or whatever the case may be, it stars lots of interesting Skeptic Zone people, check out the official YouTube channel of the Skeptic Zone, which is Skeptic Zone Podcast. And it's right there. The Skeptic Zone Podcast presents How It's Done, Applied Kinesiology. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this video in a day or two into the iTunes feed. So all you lucky people with iPhones and iPod Touches and things like that, well, you can just watch it on your video. We'll get the video downloaded. Hey, just the thing to take to the next Mind, Body, Wallet Festival and show some people. I hope you enjoy it. It was great fun to make. Learn the secrets, trick people, it's all there. Recommend it to your friends and see how you go. Oh well, I'm going to go out myself now and grab a hot dog. So while I'm doing that, enjoy the Skeptic Zone.
Grain of salt, grain of salt, grain of salt.
Let's all take this with a grain of salt. Here's Eran Segev.
Grain of salt now, grain of salt, you gotta take it with a...
John McDonough is a firefighter. You might think that it's odd to interview a firefighter for a skeptical podcast, but there's a simple explanation. John recently signed up for the Sydney Skeptics meetup group and wrote the following in his profile. I'm a firefighter whose job is to train others. Our programs are based on critical thinking and doing everything we can to understand the science of our occupation. Only that keeps us safe in a dangerous workplace. John, the critical thinking firefighter, welcome to the Skeptic Zone podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Can you start by telling us a bit about what it is that you actually do in your day job?
I'm actually a manager of one of our training sections. We deal with the live fire training and teaching other firefighters about how best to fight fires, in particular structure fires.
So you mentioned that you do live fire training. Is that as opposed to other types of training?
Yes, well, our training sort of has a theory component and then we have a practical component. The practical that we have is we light fires inside shipping containers, for want of a better word, and under controlled conditions we try and replicate the conditions that we'd have in a structure fire.
I see. And do you also train others, or did you just train others, or do you also fight fires yourself?
Well, I've been in the service since 1987, so the first, I suppose, 3/4 of my career was fighting fires. But now that I'm a more senior rank, I just train firefighters and only turn up to the larger fires on what we call an incident management team.
And do you do rescue work as well? Because I know firefighters do rescue work quite a lot.
Oh, look, for sure. I mean, once again, for all of my operational career, I suppose, when I was at a fire station and actively turning out to incidents, rescue, whether it be domestic rescues, I suppose, and motor vehicle accidents, and also industrial rescues.
In your profile, you mentioned the science of your occupation. Can you tell me a little bit about what it means, and if you can give some examples? Especially, I must admit, I'd be particularly interested if some of your examples could relate to the Victorian bushfires, because we have had a bit of a chat about that.
Yeah, look, my expertise sort of extends to the structure fire, which is a little bit different to the bushfires. But basically, just to give a bit of background, the fire service is, the New South Wales Fire Brigade has been around since 1884. When prior to that, we had insurance fire brigades, so people would insure their houses, and then the insurance brigades would protect those particular houses. And at the turn of that, or the century before last now, they decided the best way was to join those fire services together, and it became the New South Wales Fire Brigades. So we've been fighting fires for, well over 100 years, but in a lot of ways, the fighting of the fires was experiential. There was, in fact, the cultures and traditions, if you like, sort of passed on in what I sort of describe as a tribal method of teaching and learning, where the more experienced member would pass on their experiences to the next person. And we certainly, articulated that in our manuals and so on, but it was still the way we viewed fire and fought fires hadn't really changed over the last 100 years. We were taught fire science when we were recruits, and certainly knew about what we call the fire triangle, and I suppose I'll probably talk about that a bit later on. But in a lot of ways, we didn't really understand that fire environment, and therefore there were many sayings like fire is unpredictable, and I suppose in some ways, it wasn't really our fault if we didn't perform as well as we would have liked, or we got ourselves into danger because of that unpredictability, and basically it was just a bad fire that day. So, I suppose to give an example of where we've come and to lead into where my career started going in a different direction was, I joined in 1987. In 1991, I was still wearing the same uniform that was being worn in 1884. The only difference being we had a plastic helmet instead of a metal helmet. At the time, it didn't seem strange, but as I look back now, if you look at the advancements, I suppose humankind had made in that time, to still be wearing and using similar equipment 100 years later, sort of gives you an indication of where the fire service was in terms of sort of looking at fire differently. So in the early 2000s, I was a station officer in one of the fire stations in Sydney, and I read a book called Fog Attack by an English firefighter called Paul Grimwood, and he had spent time in Sweden and in Europe, where a lot of the fire service personnel there are also what we call fire engineers. So they'd done degrees at university, in particular Lund University in Sweden, and were starting to sort of apply the scientific methods to how they fought fires. And they were combining the science personnel with the operational personnel, and looking at how best to fight fires. So I found myself on a trip to Sweden in 2002 to look at how they viewed fire and some of those scientific methods. But not in bushfires, unfortunately. That is a whole science on its own. But in terms of how a fire reacts in what we call a compartment, so every structure fire, whether it be a factory or a smaller residence, is still just a compartment of a certain size and construction with a certain fuel load. And we now study very carefully how fire operates within those boundaries.
Yeah, and you mentioned the fire triangle. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, every firefighter, since the moment they join, we call it the job, since they join the job, has learned about the fire triangle. It's actually a bit more complex than that. It's sort of, but it's a combination of heat, fuel, and oxygen. And without that triangle, if you like, of heat, fuel, and oxygen, the fire can't exist. So when we look at our extinguishment methods, when we look at our control mechanisms to keep a fire how we want it to be, we look at controlling one of those three items. Obviously, when we use water, we try and cool the heat. We're very careful how we allow access to a fire in terms of oxygen, whether that's breaking a window or opening a door or what we call ventilation. And then we also try and manage the fuel load. So with that very simple sort of three-sided triangle of heat, fuel, and oxygen, we try and control the fire.
You said that you specialize in structural fire, but Is there a similar science to bushfires as well?
Oh, look, without a doubt. And I think we still have the fire triangle. We still have heat, fuel and oxygen in a bushfire. What really makes a difference, I suppose you could say the fuel is different. It's placed in a different manner. But the main difference from where I see it in terms of a structural firefighter is the smoke is allowed to escape in a bushfire or a forest fire. In a structure fire, that smoke stays within the structure or within the compartment. And it's that smoke that is also a form of fuel. And that's sort of the main difference in where our firefighting is now heading. In the past, we didn't view smoke as fuel. We just viewed it as something that inhibited our visibility. We couldn't breathe in it, so we couldn't operate in it without breathing apparatus. But we never quite made that real link to the smoke being fuel. And that's one of the major things over the last 10 years we've been working very hard on. And one of the major things that I looked at in Sweden when I first travelled there, the main impetus for a lot of this sort of study and a change in the way we fight fires, and I'll get back to, I suppose the message I put in my profile was that what we call extreme fire behaviour or rapid fire progress has killed firefighters around the world. And understanding how the fire reacts and what we can do about it is all about keeping firefighters safer. And a lot of the research in Sweden, a lot of the new techniques and tactics they were using was all based on coming to grips with three, I suppose, extreme fire phenomena, and they were flashover, backdraft, and fire gas ignitions. A lot of people have probably heard about backdraft from the old fire movie and so on, but certainly flashover and fire gas ignitions are an ever-present danger for firefighters, and our techniques now deal with that. And a lot of that is based on a firefighter having the underpinning knowledge to anticipate that event occurring and then doing something about it.
Is critical thinking applied only during training and in predefined procedures, or are firefighters also trained to think critically on their feet?
Both. I often say to my trainees that we do the most difficult job in the world. And I don't think a lot of people sort of realise that, because we work in an environment which is time critical. We have a rapidly changing, hostile environment, a very dynamic environment. So when we first arrive, we have certain things occurring. And this gets back to the old saying, fire is unpredictable. But of course, it's not unpredictable. It's totally predictable. It has to obey the laws of science. What is unpredictable is when we arrive at an incident, we're only seeing snapshots of, we're seeing a certain amount of the smoke, we're seeing what colour it is, we're seeing what velocity it's coming from the building, we're seeing how much flame we may have, we're looking at, are the windows blackened, we're looking at all these things, and what we're trying to do, we're trying to put together how much fuel might be inside, what the construction is, what the building profile is. The building profile is how air may move throughout that structure. If I open this building up in a certain way, will that allow the fire to have more air and so on? So we have, but we're only seeing small snapshots. So we're only seeing a very small percentage of the actual fire as it's showing itself. And it's our inability, I suppose, to make sense of that makes the fire very unpredictable. So we have, certainly in our procedures, we have procedures and underpinning knowledge which has us do a size up and try to make sense of what the fire is telling us. In a lot of ways, we call that reading the fire. We then have to anticipate where the fire is heading, because invariably when we start to put in place some sort of proactive firefighters in certain positions or we start to sort of fight this fire, it will have moved on from where it was before. And some of the things that we do may cause it to move in certain directions. Traditionally, this sort of very much standard operational procedure type of setup has meant that firefighters have sometimes become, I suppose, like robots, in that we will check off our checklists, our safety checklists, and we'll do what we do in certain circumstances because that's what we've done before. But one of the key things in the last 10 years is that we are training firefighters to be more critical thinkers, to be more flexible, to work outside the square. Our building construction now, our type of fuels, the type of fires we fight now require this type of thinking. It's sort of our training and our equipment we use, we look on as toolboxes, and it's up to the firefighter to select the best tool given his underpinning knowledge or her underpinning knowledge and apply it to the situation. So it's a very dynamic situation, and it's very difficult to train someone And that's why we have the live fire training. We actually light our own fires. We put firefighters in those situations under controlled conditions. So they can experience that before they actually do in a real sense.
Can you tell us about 3D firefighting?
Yeah, well, 3D firefighting sort of was a term sort of coined by Paul Grimwood, who was the author that I first read before I started my journey into looking at how to fight fires in a different way. And it involves, I think, a lot of things we've just talked about. It involves a firefighter looking in a more three-dimensional sense. In the past, we probably had a very straightforward mission, and that was basically to put water onto the fire and take that heat away. And quite often that led to sort of a tunnel-like view where firefighters would enter rapidly. They would move quickly through the structure trying to find the source of the heat. Quite often, in most fires, firefighters are lucky to be able to see their hand in front of their face, so you're using a lot of your other senses. In a lot of ways, because you're trying to access the place which is hottest to impact on that in the quickest amount of time, you actually become a bit of a heat seeker, for want of a better word. So it's very much two-dimensional. It was very much about just that one mission to get that hose line in to attack the fire. And quite often we had a mission running at the same time, and that was to rescue any people that might be inside. And quite often both of those missions cause a conflict in the thinking of the firefighter. In a 3D sense, we're looking at now at looking at the compartment in a three-dimensional sense, looking at the fuel load, looking at the surrounding construction, and once again looking at that smoke. And just, I can't, I suppose, exaggerate any more the importance of how we now view smoke. And in the development of a standard room fire, it's that smoke that causes the most danger to firefighters. If we have a small fire in a room, maybe it started on a bed, maybe it's in a kitchen, maybe it's on the stove, all fires start small in that case. And what we have then is, as that fire starts to grow, it will burn. We call it either burning leanly or burning richly. We have a flammability range, just like we do with explosive gases. If a fire has plenty of oxygen, there probably won't be much smoke. It'll burn very lean. We'll have plenty of flame. But in a compartment, it soon starts to run low on that oxygen. The fire's still burning, but the smoke will start to darken. It will start to be thicker. And we call that smoke unburnt products of combustion. There's carbon, there's soot, there's various chemicals, and that's visibly what we can see in the smoke. But what happens, that smoke is hot, it will rise, but it can't go anywhere, unlike a bushfire, so it will start to layer back down, and we call that the neutral plane, and that's the layer of smoke. So you might have heard before, whenever people are trapped in a fire, we say to get down low and go, 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 because down low you still have less heat and you will still have air to breathe and good visibility. So in a compartment, that smoke starts to come down, and we still can have a relatively small fire, but it's growing, and the smoke is getting hotter. Now, at about 700, 800 degrees, that smoke comes into its auto-ignition temperature, and it will reburn. So as that room reaches that temperature, all of the smoke inside the room, which now may only be a couple of feet off the ground, will then burst into flame, and that's what we call flashover. And from that point then, the room is then fully involved, and you're talking at temperatures above 1,000 degrees. And that can happen very rapidly in a matter of seconds. So we can have firefighters entering a structure, we have a fire burning, we have hot smoke filling the room, and the heat is increasing. We may also have a fire that is low on oxygen at this stage here, so the fire is not burning quite as well as it should. The actions of the firefighters even entering that structure, they're now providing a fresh airway. The fire can now intensify. It will get bigger, the smoke will get hotter, and once again we can bring on that flashover. So what we do now is we have firefighters, and this is something we never did in the past, we now actively try and cool that gas layer. We use our specially designed nozzles to put up a very fine water fog into those hot gases. And if we can keep those hot gases below their auto-ignition temperature, we can stop the room from flashing over and stop this rapid fire progress. So our firefighters in the past, and for most of my career, we would always hold our water. We would never use our water until we found the actual fire. Because if we used our water indiscriminately, we ran the risk of steaming ourselves, of lessening visibility, and making conditions worse. And this is where the fundamental change has been in firefighting training. And this was started by the Swedes in the early 80s, where they actively used their water before they reached the fire to cool the hot fire gases and stop the progression of the fire to full development and stop flashover from occurring. So our firefighters now sort of make those decisions on the run. They assess a fire. They assess whether it wants more oxygen and how to deal with that. If they suspected the fire wanted more air, and most fires we go to do, because once again they're enclosed in a structure, they will actually do what we call anti-ventilation. They will close doors behind them. They will keep that fire, that part of the fire triangle, the oxygen side of it, suppressed. So regardless of how hot the fire gases are, they won't be within their flammable range. So constantly our firefighters now are applying their underpinning knowledge based on science and the surrounding environment, and how can they can manipulate that to ensure the fire stays under their control. And that's a very, very powerful thing, which we never were able to do in the past without a complete understanding of how the fire operates. And that's where the critical thinking and the fire science and fire behaviour comes in.
Do you find that there are differences in approach between firefighters in different countries?
Oh, look, without a doubt. It's sort of, I've trained and lectured in Europe, Great Britain, and also in the States and in Asia. The American firefighters are probably the most different. It is funny in the fact that we're probably 95% alike and 5% different, because we do the same job. Our traditions are very similar, but we do have different ways in which we approach it. The building construction in the States is different. Without getting too technical, they have a lot of tenement buildings. They have a lot of timber buildings, which are over a couple of stories high. So they tend to use different tactics. They tend to be more aggressive. In these buildings, they tend to have a larger life risk. The buildings, most of our buildings that are medium rise to high rise, are what we call designed to survive the burnout of the contents. So it stays a contents fire and the structure itself doesn't burn. So they're your glass and steel, your double brick construction. In the States, where you have a lot of timber buildings, it becomes a structure fire very quickly, and the life risk is enormous. So they've devised different ways of doing that. America is a very different fire service model. They have over 30,000 separate fire services over there. In Australia, we have 11 separate fire services. They have a huge volunteer base where training probably isn't as good as it should be. And they also have this very gung-ho attitude. When I was in the States last, I remember a firefighter telling me that the fire service is 100 years of tradition unimpeded by progress, so, which is very true. And it really was my own experiences up until a couple of years ago. But the last 10 to 15 years, certainly in Australia, the fire services have moved very much towards critical thinking and a science-based approach, whereas in the States, I suppose this very traditional approach that it's okay to be 100 years of unimpeded by progress. And they hold that very dear to their hearts in some ways. And in some ways, the service, it's very easy for that to occur because there's a lot of ownership. I suppose when people do things hard, they put their lives at risk in some circumstances. It's very hard to change if you've been successful. And I say that in inverted commas because some of the problems in the fire service is, for example, every fire I've been to is out. It eventually goes out. Sometimes it's very difficult to gauge how successful you were if the fire goes out and no one's injured. So I think in the past we haven't been as good at debriefing and validating our own techniques and experiences because it's been so easy to blame the fire and say it was just a bad fire that day. So in the US, they tend to be, some brigades are very, very proactive and very modern and cutting edge, and others are very, very traditional. In Europe, once again, traditions are very important, but overall, and probably led by Scandinavia and the UK, very cutting edge in their technique, in their understanding, in their training of fire science and fire behaviour. And in Australia, we're probably somewhere in between, but we are very much a British, our traditions lie with the British Fire Service. So we tend to be very proactive in that area as well.
Among people who work in dangerous professions, there is often a high level of superstition. Do you find that that's true among your colleagues? And do you have any personal superstitions related to your profession? Interesting question. Look, I tend to agree with you on that. I suppose there are some firefighters that are superstitious. I think a lot of what we did was, as you kept on doing it, you build experiences. I suppose in some ways, before we really concentrated on the underpinning science and fire behaviour, we tended to look at a fire and say, that doesn't look good, or say things like, I just knew it
this wasn't going to turn out well, or I looked at it and just knew it wasn't right. But we had trouble articulating that. Just from our experiences, we would sort of say things like that, and we would maybe anticipate things before they happened, but still not quite understand why they happened, because of just from experience and just from seeing things occur in the past. But in a lot of ways, I think firefighters are probably quite the opposite. They tend to be very practical people. They tend to trust, trust more their own abilities rather than leave things to fate, or, for want of a better word, they tend to trust in their comrades. And yeah, just very practical people. So I suppose that offsets the superstitious angle in some ways. But interesting question. But I don't think we're overrepresented in the superstitious side of things. And like I said, I think the practical nature of the job probably overrides that in a lot of cases.
John McDonough, thank you very much for joining me on the Skeptic Zone podcast.
No, thank you very much for having me. It was great.
Grain of salt, you gotta take it with a...
Hi, I'm Dr. Ginger Campbell. I started the Brain Science podcast in December 2006 with the tagline, "The show for everyone who has a brain," because you don't need a PhD to enjoy my podcast. All you need is curiosity about how our brains make us who we are. The Brain Science podcast is not a self-help show, but understanding how the brain works will give you useful insights into your own behavior and the behavior of others. On the show, I talk about the latest books about the brain, and I interview leading scientists. Of course, I would love to be discovered by NPR. But until then, you can find the Brain Science Podcast in iTunes and at brainsciencepodcast.com.
Now it's time for Dr. Rachie Reports with Dr. Rachel Dunlop.
Hello listeners, and welcome to Dr. Rachie Reports. Well, the AVN, or Australian Vaccination Network, are not happy. It seems another venue has pulled the plug on them at the last minute. This time, the Uniting Church in the city of Perth withdrew access to their venue for a scheduled seminar due to be held in Perth on Friday night, which is tonight. According to the church, there were concerns raised by a number of people, including prominent church members who are experts in the field of ethics and public health, that the message promoted by the AVN is not in line with the ethos and values of the Uniting Church in Australia. Meryl Dorey, who is the immediate past president and now media spokesperson, received notification as she was about to board a plane to travel from Brisbane to Perth, a 5-hour and 3,600 kilometre journey. According to a newsletter sent after the event, Mrs. Dorey was queuing to catch her flight when the Mission Development Officer for the Uniting Church called to break the news. With less than 24 hours to go before the scheduled event and no venue for the 100-plus people already booked, Mrs. Dorey had no choice but to forfeit her plane tickets, valued at $750, and return home. And she is livid. Now, the AVN organised the current seminar to capitalise on the recent spate of adverse reactions to the seasonal flu vaccine in children under 5 years of age. The vaccination program was suspended several weeks ago and remains so, following reports of high fevers and febrile convulsions. Initial thoughts that a bad batch was to blame have since been discounted, following testing and information that more than one batch was involved. The vaccine manufacturers, CSL, and independent bodies are continuing to investigate. But to date, Australia-wide, over 400 reactions have been reported in 5 states, the majority of which occurred in Perth, Western Australia. Most children have recovered, but one child in Queensland died 12 hours after receiving the vaccine. The coroner found no evidence to implicate the vaccine, but investigations are ongoing. Yet, despite this, Mrs. Dorey states in her blurb for the seminar, quote, "To date, more than 300 serious reactions to the current seasonal flu shot have been reported in children under the age of 5, with one child known to have died within hours of being vaccinated." There is no mention that the coroner has found no evidence of this. So the AVN seminar, which has since been cancelled, was called Flu Vaccines and Informed Choice and was to cover, quote, "This talk examines the risk of flu to children, the effectiveness of the vaccine and the additional risks to children's health of adding another vaccine to the childhood schedule." In her talk, Meryl Dorey will discuss how vaccines are intended to work and why it is that they often don't. She will talk about the known side effects of childhood and adult shots and reveal that according to the Australian government, as few as 1% of vaccine reactions ever get reported, leading to a belief that they are perfectly safe, unquote. But one of the criticisms that has been levelled at the government is the question of how thoroughly the current 2010 seasonal flu triple antigen has been tested. This year's vaccine contains 3 viral components: the H1N1, the H3N2 and the B Brisbane strain. Ian Barr, who is the Deputy Director of the World Health Organisation's Influenza Centre in Melbourne, was interviewed on Monday, April the 26th, about the question of whether the current seasonal flu combination has been tested in clinical trials. Here's an excerpt from that interview played on ABC Radio.
In Australia, we don't require that the influenza vaccine, the seasonal vaccine, is tested for combinations, but they have done that overseas. So they have tested, in fact, giving a full seasonal vaccine with the swine flu, so 4 vaccines at once, if you like, and there were no untoward effects there. So I think there's a high expectation that the combination of these 3 viruses will be no different from any other 3 viruses which we include every year without doing formal safety testing, which takes quite a period of time and it is extremely expensive and time-consuming.
So in your opinion, the fact that it is a combination vaccine would have nothing to do with this situation that we've got at the moment, as far as you know now?
I think that's unlikely to be a factor. Certainly all viruses are slightly different, but in terms of how they're produced in the laboratory and tested in the laboratory and then made in the commercial scale vaccine production areas, they're all investigated individually for any particular differences in those viruses, which might lead to some of these things that we're seeing currently, such as fever. So I think that it's unlikely, but I guess we have to wait and see on analysis of these particular batches.
Is it possible that it might have just been a bad batch?
Well, I think there's multiple batches involved, so I think that's unlikely again. If it was a single batch, then you might think that that might be the case, but if multiple batches are involved, then that's less likely, I think. But again, we still need to wait.
So every year, CSL's FluVax vaccine contains fragments of 3 different types of influenza virus, as recommended by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And this depends on the strains of infectious flu in the environment at the time. In addition, flu viruses mutate from season to season, so vaccines become less effective and need to be modified to keep up with the current mutants. The flu vaccine is tried and true technology, only changing for the type of viral components year to year, and there has not been a problem before. But flu vaccines are tested in Australia in clinical trials, just this combination has not. FluVax Junior was tested in 2005 and 2006, and this showed a very good safety and efficacy profile in clinical trials. In a group of 298 children, there were no reports of serious adverse events during the vaccination period or 7 days following. PanVax Junior, which is the thimerosal-free H1N1 vaccine for children, was tested in a 2009 trial and showed approximately 30% mild to moderate adverse events in children under the age of 8. The clinical trial data was evaluated by the TGA and reviewed by the Expert Advisory Committee on Prescription Medicines. PanVax was approved by the TGA on December 3, 2009, and the National Immunisation Program began on September 30th, 2009. Since then, the TGA has been closely monitoring any side effects from the use of the vaccine. And to date, approximately 6 million doses of PanVax have been distributed in Australia. And a total of 1,289 adverse events have been reported to the TGA. But importantly, it has not yet been clearly established if these adverse events reported in Perth, Western Australia, constitute a true spike in adverse events. The federal government's Chief Medical Officer, Professor Jim Bishop, said some 3 million doses of the seasonal flu vaccine have gone out this year, with up to 2/3 sent to Perth, Western Australia. This could be a partial explanation as to why the state has experienced a much higher rate of complications, normally expected in 1 out of every 1,000 to 10,000 cases. And also, Western Australia now provides the seasonal flu shot for free to children under 5, whereas the rest of the country doesn't. The initiative to distribute free vaccinations for children was started after a 2007 flu season where 8 children across Australia under the age of 5 died within 24 hours of developing mild and non-specific symptoms of respiratory infection. As part of the trial, in 2008, almost 65,000 children aged 5 and younger in Western Australia received free flu vaccinations. And this reduced hospitalisations by 88%, the state's health department has said. But then, scientific facts and evidence are not something that the AVN seems to care too much about, but perhaps the Uniting Church does. This is not the first time the AVN has been refused access to a venue after having organised, booked and advertised a seminar. In 2009, they were forced to find another venue at short notice after a school in South Australia declined their appearance following notification of the nature of their material. Someone pondered on Facebook today that the AVN would save themselves a lot of time, hassle and money if they weren't so liberal with the truth. Whilst publicly claiming to be pro-choice, the AVN preaches a clear anti-vaccination message designed to scare parents into shunning vaccinations for their children. Here's an excerpt from Australia's nightly news show, the 7pm Project.
Australia's immunisation rate is now at a 7-year low, with only 83% of 4-year-olds covered. The issue has divided parents, none more so than Sonia and Martin Williams. The vaccine debate almost ended their marriage.
I like to see myself as an open person that just looking at all the evidence out there.
But if you had a choice, you wouldn't have vaccinated if you had a choice.
Oh, yeah. If we had a choice, you were open to it, I would have explored different avenues for sure.
Basically, it came down to a stalemate, and I literally had to put the marriage on the line. It was either the kids get vaccinated or Martin leave. So it was sort of ended up being an obvious choice after that, didn't it?
At this stage, the kids are healthy. Ethan has a slight learning difficulty and so forth. Can that be contributed to the vaccination? Don't know.
How dare you? The speech impediment is not due to the vaccinations. Oh my God, it is not to do.
How do you know?
As you can see, it still rages on.
Suffice it to say, the AVN has flooded the church with letters of complaint, claiming a right to free speech, likening the church's cancellation of the seminar to the persecution of Jesus, amongst other things. Here's what Meryl Dorey had to say. Quote, "I'm certainly not saying that what we're doing is godlike in any way, but I mean that the sort of things that Jesus put up with in his lifetime is the sort of things that are happening with anyone who questions the status quo on vaccinations." The church has also issued a statement which says, amongst other things, one of the church's concerns is that there may be a public perception that the UCIC does not support childhood vaccinations due to the AVN seminar being held in our rooms. In addition, the level of public response has raised security concerns for other users of our buildings. This is something we wish to avoid. If you'd like to contact the church with your thoughts, please go to www.wa.uca.org.au and follow the links to contact us. And until next time, this has been Dr. Rachie Reports.
This is Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com. Skeptoid is a short weekly podcast taking a critical look at the pseudosciences that infect popular culture. Whenever I'm not locked in the recording studio, I'm listening to The Skeptic Zone.
Thank you for listening to The Skeptic Zone. Now, my good friend Travis Royce sent me a message, so I'm going to pass it along to you. Granite State Skeptics will be having a skeptics panel at GraniteCon in Manchester, New Hampshire, on the 23rd of May. Lots of interesting people coming along, skeptical people to take part of the GraniteCon. please have a look for more information at granitecon.com or, of course, at granitestateskeptics.com. Anybody in the area, this is going to be really worth checking out. They got some people coming from the James Randi Educational Foundation. One of my good friends, Kitty, is going along. Jeff Wagg, lots of other people. Certainly worth checking out. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone, and thank you for those people writing in telling me that, yes, last week I helped them go to sleep. As soon as they hear my voice, off they go. So until next week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from Sydney, Australia.
You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone. Visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for comments, contacts, and extra video reports.
The Skeptic Zone.